Daniel Pomerantz. He's the CEO of the nonprofit RealityCheck Research, joining us from Tel Aviv. Daniel, thank you so much for giving us your time here on this news hour. This latest information coming from Netanyahu's coalition partner, is this just a delaying tactic? Because it may be on hold for now, but over the next few weeks it will be put back into parliament. How is this going to appease protesters at all?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I don't believe it is a mere tactic. We've been seeing for weeks a very rapid push to try and push through these laws. This is a sea change. It is entirely different that they are now talking about pausing a little bit, and even Netanyahu has been speaking about potentially making compromise. One thing that's most important to emphasize, as you can see from the images, these protests are just an ocean of Israeli flags. This is an exercise in passionate democracy. People are protesting in freedom. They're protesting in safety. Their protests are very in favor of the police and the military and the country itself. Oftentimes they sing the national anthem at these protests, and the protests are based on the idea that the protesters care very much about what's best for the country. It is most certainly not an anti-Israel protest.
Daniel, could this then be the beginning of the end for Netanyahu and his coalition partners? Because if we speak about democracy, some of the right-wing elements of this government are very much the opposite of that. And as you've just said, you've got 600,000 people in Israel who've come out to fight for their democracy.
Well, the nature of a democracy is not whether every individual person who serves in government is a perfect person, but whether the system itself provides adequate checks and balances. And that's what these protests are about. Now, whether the current coalition stays or doesn't stay, Israel is a system that provides checks and balances on power. Now, there's an effort by some of the coalition members to make certain changes in that system. And in fairness, there are certain changes in the judicial system that would be appropriate, but they have to be done in the right way. And the protesters are not saying that they will not have any change whatsoever. In fact, recently, Israel's President Herzog presented a very thoughtful compromise that involved making changes to the judiciary, but also making changes to the way the parliament functions so that the balance of power would remain, but just in a more strong and stable form.
And Daniel, you mentioned some of these changes that would be appropriate. Can you give us some of those examples? Because what we've been looking at are really the changes that the protesters seem to be against. But could Israel benefit from some changes to its judiciary?
Well, absolutely. One of the things you mentioned before, for example, is that these changes could prevent the Supreme Court from overruling Israel's basic laws, which is basically Israel's constitution. Well, there's no democracy in the world where the Supreme Court can overrule the Constitution. That's the whole point of a constitution. And so if we were to give Israel's Supreme Court less power to overrule basic laws, we would also have to change the way that basic laws are made so that they cannot be so easily changed by the parliament. And that's right now, basic laws can be changed too easily. The only check on that is the Supreme Court. So you could reduce the Supreme Court's power to change basic laws while simultaneously reducing the parliament's power to change those basic laws as well. That would be one example in which Israel would move more toward the system that is commonplace among most modern Western liberal democracies, of which Israel is one.
Daniel, is there any pressure right now on the Israeli government from its allies, like the United States in particular, who have called for calm, of course, as we see weeks of these protests? Washington last week even expressed some concern about the rolling back of laws that stop the settlements being built in Gaza. Does that affect Israel's government, Netanyahu's government at all, about the way it's going about dealing with these protests and judicial reform?
Well, first of all, let me correct you. There are no settlements in Gaza. There have not been since Israel pulled all of them out in 2005. And there's no intention for them to ever be there. In fact, there's no Israeli presence in Gaza whatsoever. There was a change to the law about settlements in the West Bank, but even that did not involve building new settlements. It merely involved a change in the way that the growth of existing settlements is approved. But that said, the United States has weighed in on this issue. But recently, the U.S. ambassador made a very strong statement that they are absolutely not involved in backing the protests or the protesters, that this is absolutely an organic domestic phenomenon, and that this is the domestic voice of the Israeli people making itself heard and not a foreign voice.
Daniel Pomerantz, appreciate your analysis and you taking the time to speak to us live there from Tel Aviv. And of course...